The city of Aachen sits at the western edge of Germany like a broken tooth. Medieval stone and modern concrete fused together by fire and time. By October 1944, it has become something worse than a battlefield. It is a grid of craters and skeletal buildings where American forces have been grinding forward for weeks, pushing through rubble corridors and machine gun nests, losing men to snipers they never see in booby traps hidden in doorways. The weather is cold and wet, the kind of October that turns everything gray and makes movement slow. Foxholes fill with water overnight. Uniforms stay damp. Visibility shrinks to a few blocks, and every corner feels like a trap. Yet despite the artillery, the armor, and the steady pressure of American infantry, one strongpoint remains. A cluster of ruined buildings near the city center where 850 German troops have dug in and refused to move. They are a mix of Wehrmacht soldiers and SS troops, supplied through tunnels that snake under the rubble, convinced by their commander that relief columns are on the way, and that surrender would be betrayal. The Americans do not believe the relief story, but they know the math. A direct assault on the strongpoint will cost them hundreds of casualties. And even if they take it, the cost will be measured in body bags and letters home that no one wants to write. So the siege continues, day after day, artillery pounding the same positions, patrols testing the perimeter, and men on both sides waiting for something to break. Into this stalemate steps a figure who does not fit the image of a soldier in a city being destroyed one block at a time. He is a young American officer, early 20s, with a college education and a job that depends not on shooting but on talking. He is a liaison, a translator, a man whose fluency in German has made him valuable in a war that needs translators more than it needs riflemen. His name will not appear in the headlines, and his rank is low enough that the Germans will dismiss him as insignificant. Yet he has been studying the siege for days, not through maps and casualty reports, but through conversations with prisoners, through the rhythm of small surrenders and the language men use when they are deciding whether to keep fighting. He has learned that surrender is not a single decision. It is a sequence of smaller choices made under pressure, and those choices are shaped by language, by timing, by the presence or absence of alternatives. The SS officer commanding the strongpoint has told his men that surrender is cowardice, that the war can still be won, that relief is coming. The Americans know none of those things are true, but knowing does not matter if the men inside the strongpoint believe it. The young officer's task is not to storm the position or starve it out. It is to create a crack in that belief, a moment where the logic of survival can overpower the rhetoric of sacrifice. It is a task that will make him look weak, that will subject him to mockery and contempt, and that may not work at all. The contradiction at the heart of the siege is simple and brutal. The SS expect their men to die rather than surrender. The Americans expect pragmatism, the cold calculation of lives saved versus lives spent. And the young officer is about to attempt something that looks like neither heroism nor pragmatism, but something quieter and more uncertain. He is about to walk into the strongpoint under a white flag, knowing that the SS commander will see that flag not as a symbol of negotiation, but as proof of weakness. Yet he also knows that weakness, properly used, can be a kind of intelligence. If the SS commander's authority depends on being the only voice his men hear, then introducing another voice, calm, reasonable, offering terms that sound more real than promises of relief, might be enough to start a fracture. The officer does not expect to convince the SS commander. He expects to plant doubt among the Wehrmacht soldiers, the ones who are tired and cold and know that the war is ending badly. It is a gamble built on language and psychology, and it will begin with humiliation. The white flag will be mocked. The offer will be rejected. Yet the rejection itself will carry information, and that information will matter more than pride. The siege has become a test not of firepower, but of patience. And patience is something the young officer has in greater supply than artillery shells. The strongpoint is surrounded, isolated, and running out of time. The Americans can wait. The question is whether the Germans can. The strongpoint is not a fortress in any traditional sense. It is a collection of ruined buildings whose walls have been blown open by artillery, and whose upper floors have collapsed into heaps of brick and timber, yet whose cellars remain intact. Those cellars form a network, interconnected through tunnels and passages that allow German troops to move between positions without exposing themselves to American fire. The tunnels are narrow and dark, lit by candles or handheld lamps, and they smell of damp stone, gunpowder residue, and human sweat. Inside, the Germans have stacked ammunition crates, barrels of water, and ration boxes stolen from warehouses before the American encirclement closed. They have set up firing positions at windows and doorways, angled so that any American patrol trying to approach from the street will be caught in overlapping fields of fire. Machine guns are positioned in corners where the rubble provides cover, and riflemen occupy upper floor positions that still offer sight lines down the approach routes. It is a defensive maze designed not to win, but to make winning too expensive. And for weeks it has worked. American patrols probe the perimeter and withdraw under fire. Artillery shells pound the buildings, but the cellars absorb the blasts, and the Germans emerge from below once the barrage lifts. Armor cannot maneuver in the rubble-choked streets, and infantry advancing without armor support becomes easy targets for snipers. The weather adds another layer of misery. October in Aachen is cold and wet, the kind of cold that seeps through uniforms and into bones. Rain falls intermittently, turning the rubble into slick surfaces where men slip and twist ankles. Foxholes on the American side of the perimeter fill with water overnight, and soldiers bail them out in the morning only to watch them fill again by evening. Visibility is poor, limited by fog and smoke from fires that burn in the ruins without anyone left to put them out. The smell of the city is a mix of wet concrete dust, charred wood, and the sour stench of bodies that have not been recovered because the positions they fell in are still under fire. Civilians are trapped inside the strongpoint's perimeter, hiding in cellars and basements, adding a complication that the battlefield does not usually permit. American artillery officers hesitate before calling in fire missions because they know civilians are present, and that hesitation gives the Germans time to reposition and reinforce. The siege has become a grinding test of endurance, and both sides are losing. The American battalion tasked with clearing the sector has already taken casualties that do not make the headlines, but are felt in every squad. Men step on booby traps rigged with grenades or mortar shells. Snipers fire from positions that seem abandoned, then disappear before return fire can suppress them. Patrols sent to probe the perimeter return with wounded, and the wounded are carried back through streets that offer no cover and no safety. The battalion commander knows that a frontal assault on the strongpoint is possible, but the cost will be measured in dozens of dead and wounded, and even then success is not guaranteed. The tunnels allow the Germans to retreat, regroup, and counterattack from positions the Americans thought they had already cleared. The siege has become a problem without a clean solution, and the pressure to end it is mounting from higher command. Inside the strongpoint, the SS officer in command has positioned himself as the ideological anchor of the defense. He moves through the cellars with deliberate calm, speaking to his troops in a tone that mixes reassurance with warning. He reminds them that retreat is betrayal, that the Führer's orders are clear, that relief columns are being organized and will break through within days. He speaks as if certainty can substitute for supply, as if conviction can hold the perimeter when ammunition runs low. Among the SS troops, his words are received with the ritual obedience of men who have been trained to see doubt as weakness. Yet among the Wehrmacht soldiers, older men, conscripts, men who have fought since 1940 and seen the war turn, doubt has begun to spread. It is not defiance, not yet. It is exhaustion, the quiet realization that the war is ending badly, and that Aachen will not be relieved because there are no relief columns left to send. They do not speak this doubt aloud, because the SS officer is watching, and because speaking doubt in front of the SS can be dangerous. Yet the doubt is there, visible in the way they check their ammunition and ration their water, in the way they look toward the tunnels and wonder how long the supplies will last. The strongpoint survival depends on discipline and denial, and both are beginning to fray. The Americans concede this from the outside, in the way patrols encounter less aggressive fire, in the way prisoners speak when questioned. The siege is not over, but it is changing, and the young American officer who will soon walk under a white flag has been studying that change with the attention of a man whose job depends on understanding when exhaustion becomes decision. The American officer assigned to attempt negotiations did not enter the war expecting to carry white flags into enemy strongpoints. He entered it as a college student interrupted, a young man whose pre-war life revolved around literature seminars and part-time library work, whose understanding of Germany came from books rather than battlefields. He had studied German language and literature because it interested him, because the structure of the language appealed to his mind, and because he believed that understanding another culture was a form of education worth pursuing. That education ended on December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor turned theoretical knowledge into a wartime skill. He enlisted, was processed through basic training, and then reassigned almost immediately. The Army needed riflemen, but it needed translators more, and his fluency in German made him valuable in a way that marksmanship could not. He was pulled from infantry training and sent to intelligence liaison school, where he learned not how to fight but how to listen, how to interrogate prisoners without theatrics, how to translate not just words but intent. It was unglamorous work, the kind of job that earned no medals and generated no stories. Yet it required a particular kind of patience and attention. He learned to recognize when a prisoner was lying, not because the words were wrong, but because the rhythm was off. Because men under stress speak differently when they are performing versus when they are simply tired and telling the truth. By the time he arrived at Aachen, he had interviewed dozens of German prisoners, and he had begun to notice patterns. Surrender was not a single moment of decision. It was a process, a series of small calculations made under pressure. Men surrendered when they believed the war was lost, but belief alone was not enough. They also needed permission. Not formal permission, but social permission, the sense that surrender would not mark them as cowards in the eyes of their peers. That permission was easier to grant when the officer giving the order was Wehrmacht rather than SS. When the unit had suffered casualties and exhaustion had replaced ideology, when the act of surrender could be framed as obedience to orders rather than personal weakness. The officer had also learned that the SS viewed surrender differently. For them, it was contamination, something that spread if not contained, and their authority depended on preventing that spread. An SS officer could not allow his men to surrender without losing control, because control was the only thing keeping the unit together. The most dangerous moment in any negotiation was not the refusal, but the pause before it. The moment when the SS officer had to decide whether to reject the offer loudly or quietly. And that decision revealed how fragile his authority actually was. The young officer's task at Aachen was not to convince the SS commander to surrender. He understood that was impossible. The SS commander's identity was tied to the defense. His authority built on the rhetoric of sacrifice and defiance. Asking him to surrender was asking him to dismantle himself in front of his men. And no amount of logic or negotiation could compel that. Instead, the officer's task was to create conditions where the Wehrmacht soldiers could surrender without the SS stopping them. That required language, timing, and an understanding of how hierarchies fracture under pressure. It required him to plant the idea of surrender in a way that bypassed the SS commander's authority, to make the offer visible to the troops without making it seem like an appeal to mutiny. It also required him to accept humiliation as part of the process, because the SS commander would mock the white flag, would call it cowardice, would use the officer's presence as proof that the Americans were weak. That mockery was expected. What mattered was what came after it. Whether the Wehrmacht soldiers heard the mockery as truth or as performance. whether the offer lingered in their minds after the officer left. The officer prepared for the negotiation by studying the strongpoint's layout, by listening to reports from patrols, by interviewing prisoners who had escaped through the tunnels. He learned which buildings were still occupied, which cellars served as command posts, which officers were SS, and which were Wehrmacht. He learned the names of the units, the backgrounds of the soldiers, the rhetoric the SS commander used when speaking to his troops. He also learned that the strongpoint was running low on supplies, that the tunnels were being used less frequently because the Americans had collapsed some of them, that the Wehrmacht soldiers were beginning to question whether relief was actually coming. All of this was intelligence, but it was also psychological terrain, and the officer mapped it with the same care a rifleman might study a field of fire. His rank was low, a lieutenant, which meant the SS commander would see him as insignificant, a messenger rather than a decision maker. That insignificance was both a weakness and a tool. It allowed him to enter the strongpoint without being seen as a threat, to deliver the message without forcing the SS commander to treat him as an equal. It also meant that if the negotiation failed, the failure could be dismissed as the work of a junior officer rather than a strategic defeat. The officer understood that his role was to be underestimated, to walk into the strongpoint carrying a white flag and an offer that would be rejected, and to return with information that mattered more than pride. The mockery would sting, but the sting was temporary. What mattered was whether the Wehrmacht soldiers heard the offer and remembered it when the SS commander's authority began to crack. The first attempt to open negotiations happens on a morning when the shelling has stopped and the city feels quieter than it has in days. The American officer stands at the edge of the perimeter with a small security detail, holding a white flag made from a bedsheet tied to a length of wood. The flag is visible from a distance, and the officer knows that every German soldier in the strongpoint is watching. He also knows that the SS commander is watching, deciding whether to shoot or to listen. Loudspeakers mounted on American vehicles announce the intent in German, the words formal and procedural, explaining that a negotiator is approaching under a flag of truce and that firing on him would violate the laws of war. The announcement is not meant to appeal to honor. It is meant to create a record, to make the act of shooting the officer a decision rather than an accident. The firing stops, not because the Germans trust the flag, but because they are curious. The officer walks forward slowly, the flag held high, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He does not carry a weapon. His uniform is clean, his posture calm, and his face betrays no fear, even though fear is what he feels. A German soldier emerges from the rubble and gestures for the officer to stop. The soldier is young, younger than the officer, with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a wary expression that suggests he has been given orders, but does not entirely trust them. The soldier approaches, speaks briefly in German, then ties a blindfold over the officer's eyes. The blindfold is rough cloth, and it smells of dust and sweat. The officer allows it without protest, because protest would end the negotiation before it began. He is led forward, guided by hands on his shoulders, his steps careful on uneven ground. He hears voices around him, German words spoken in low tones, the scrape of boots on rubble, the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the ruins. He is taken down a set of stairs into a cellar, and the temperature drops as he descends. The air is damp and heavy, and the sounds outside fade into muffled echoes. When the blindfold is removed, he is standing in a small room lit by a single lamp, and across from him is the SS officer who commands the strongpoint. The SS officer is older, perhaps 40, with the kind of face that looks carved rather than formed, all sharp angles and hard lines. He wears his uniform with precision, every button fastened, every crease sharp, as if appearance is a form of discipline. He does not stand when the American officer enters. He sits behind a table made from a plank of wood balanced on two crates, and he watches the officer with an expression that is not hostile so much as evaluative, as if he is deciding whether the officer is worth his time. The American officer begins to speak, his German formal and clear. He explains that the siege cannot be sustained, that the strongpoint is surrounded and isolated, that relief columns are not coming because the front has moved too far west. He explains that surrender terms can be arranged with dignity, that prisoners will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, that there is no shame in choosing survival over sacrifice when the strategic situation has already been decided. His tone is calm, almost bureaucratic, as if he is discussing logistics rather than life and death. The SS officer listens without interruption, his face betraying nothing. When the American officer finishes, there is a pause, a silence that stretches long enough to feel deliberate. Then the SS officer speaks, and his words are delivered not with anger but with contempt. He calls the white flag a coward's tool, a symbol of weakness that insults the German soldiers who have chosen to fight rather than betray their oath. He calls the American officer a messenger of defeat, sent to spread doubt among men who have not yet lost their will. He says that the strongpoint will hold, that relief is coming, that the Americans have underestimated the resolve of German soldiers. His words are loud, louder than necessary, and they are delivered not just to the officer, but to the Wehrmacht soldier standing in the shadows of the cellar, watching. The mockery is deliberate and public, a performance designed to reinforce the SS officer's authority, to remind his men that surrender is not an option, and that the Americans are offering nothing but humiliation disguised as mercy. The American officer listens without responding, because response would turn the conversation into an argument, and arguments can be won. He needs the mockery to stand on its own, to be heard by the Wehrmacht soldiers without rebuttal, because rebuttal would give the SS officers something to push against. When the SS officer finishes, the American officer nods once, thanks him for his time in formal German, and is blindfolded again and escorted back out of the strongpoint. The walk back feels longer than the walk in. The officer is aware of the eyes watching him, of the Wehrmacht soldiers standing in doorways and at windows, their faces tired and their postures slumped. He is aware that the mockery he just endured was heard by every one of them, and he is aware that the SS officer performed it as much for them as for him. Yet he is also aware of what the mockery revealed. It was too loud, too insistent, as if the SS officer were trying to convince his own men as much as reject the Americans. When the blindfold is removed and the officer is standing back on the American side of the perimeter, he does not speak immediately. He stands for a moment, letting the tension drain from his shoulders, then walks back to the command post to file his report. The report is short. The SS commander rejected the offer with contempt. Yet the officer adds a note at the end, a single line that will matter later. The Wehrmacht soldiers did not cheer. They looked at the floor, and when the mockery ended, the room was silent. That silence, the officer believes, is more important than the words. The officer returns to the American lines and does not argue for another assault. He does not demand immediate action or express frustration at the rejection. Instead, he tells his battalion commander that the strongpoint is ready to fracture, but only if the pressure is applied in a specific way, not through violence, but through time and isolation. The battalion commander listens, skeptical but willing to wait, because every option they have tried so far has cost lives without producing results. The Americans tighten the perimeter, cutting off the last resupply tunnel by collapsing it with explosives placed during a night patrol. They increase the frequency of patrols around the strongpoint's edges, not to attack, but to be visible, to remind the Germans that they are surrounded and that the encirclement is not weakening. Then they stop shelling. The artillery that has been pounding the strongpoint for days goes silent, and the silence is louder than the explosions because it signals something the Germans cannot interpret. Is it preparation for an assault? Is it exhaustion? Is it mercy? The uncertainty spreads through the strongpoint like fog, and the Wehrmacht soldiers begin to ask questions their officers cannot answer. The officer sends another message. But this time he does not send it to the SS commander. He sends it to the Wehrmacht NCOs, delivered through prisoners who are being returned to the strongpoint after medical treatment. The prisoners are given clean bandages, Red Cross parcels, and a written note that explains surrender terms in plain language. The note is not signed by a high-ranking officer. It is signed by the young lieutenant, and it is addressed to no one in particular, as if it is information rather than an offer. The note says that surrender terms are available, that there will be no reprisals, no public humiliation, and that the offer will remain open for 24 hours. It says that any soldier wishing to surrender can do so by moving to a specific section of the perimeter at dawn, where American troops will hold fire and accept their surrender. It says nothing about the SS commander, nothing about the chain of command, nothing that could be interpreted as incitement to mutiny. It is simply information, delivered quietly, and left to be read or ignored. The SS commander intercepts the note and tears it up in front of his men. He calls it propaganda, a lie designed to break their will, and he reminds them that surrender is cowardice and that relief is coming. Yet the Wehrmacht soldiers have already seen the note, and they know what it said. They know the offer exists, and they know the SS commander destroyed it. That knowledge changes the calculation. The offer is no longer hypothetical. It is real, and the SS commander's response to it reveals something about his authority. If the offer were truly meaningless, there would be no need to destroy it so publicly. The fact that he did suggests that he fears it, and fear is a crack. That night, a Wehrmacht sergeant slips out of the strongpoint under cover of darkness. He moves through the rubble carefully, avoiding the patrols, and when he reaches the American perimeter, he calls out in German, his voice low and steady. An American patrol takes him to the command post, where the young officer is waiting. The conversation is brief. The sergeant explains that the SS commander has less control than he claims, that many of the Wehrmacht soldiers are ready to surrender, but that they need a way to do it without the SS shooting them. He explains that the tunnels are being watched, that any soldier who tries to leave individually will be stopped, but that if enough of them move together at the same time, the SS will not be able to stop them all. The sergeant asks if the Americans will hold fire if the Wehrmacht soldiers move to the designated perimeter section at dawn, and the officer confirms that they will. The sergeant nods, thanks him, and slips back into the strongpoint before sunrise. The officer spends the rest of the night preparing. He briefs the American troops at the perimeter section, explaining that Wehrmacht soldiers will be approaching with their hands raised and that no one is to fire unless fired upon. He positions himself at the front of the perimeter, visible and unarmed, so that the Wehrmacht soldiers have a focal point to walk toward. He does not know if the sergeant's plan will work. He does not know if the Wehrmacht soldiers will follow through, or if the SS commander will stop them, or if the entire thing will collapse into violence. Yet he has done what he can, and now the only thing left is to wait. The turning point of the siege is not an explosion or a charge. It is a quiet decision made by tired men who have been given a choice they did not have before, and who have decided that survival is not the same as cowardice. The hierarchy that held the strongpoint together is fracturing, not through rebellion, but through disobedience so quiet it barely registers as disobedience at all. And when dawn comes, the officer will be standing at the perimeter, waiting to see if words can accomplish what artillery could not. Dawn arrives cold and gray, the kind of morning where the light seems to come from nowhere in particular, just a slow brightening of the sky that turns the rubble from black to pale gray. The American officer stands at the designated section of the perimeter, his hands empty, his posture calm, his eyes fixed on the strongpoint. Around him, American soldiers crouch behind rubble and broken walls, their rifles aimed but their fingers off the triggers, waiting for orders that may or may not come. The officer does not speak. He simply stands, visible, a focal point in a landscape that has been defined by concealment and cover for weeks. Then, movement. A figure emerges from the rubble on the German side. hands raised, moving slowly. Another figure follows, then another, then a group. They are Wehrmacht soldiers, some young and some old, all of them carrying the exhaustion of a siege that has lasted too long. They move toward the American perimeter with the careful deliberation of men who know they are gambling their lives on the assumption that the Americans will keep their word. Their weapons are slung over their shoulders or carried in one hand, barrels pointed down, no threat implied. They do not run. They walk, and their walking is louder than any shout could be. The SS commander realizes what is happening and emerges from a cellar entrance, his voice rising in a shout that carries across the rubble. He orders the Wehrmacht soldiers to stop, to return to their positions, to remember their oaths. A few SS troops appear beside him, rifles raised, and for a moment the entire scene balances on a knife edge. Yet the Wehrmacht soldiers do not stop. They keep walking, and the SS commander's shouts become background noise, words without power. One SS trooper fires a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle sharp and sudden, but no one returns fire and no one stops walking. The SS commander's authority, which has held the strongpoint together through weeks of siege, evaporates in the space of minutes. The Wehrmacht soldiers have made their choice, and the SS cannot stop them without shooting their own men. And shooting their own men would be an admission that the hierarchy has already failed. The American officer steps forward as the first Wehrmacht soldiers reach the perimeter. He speaks in German, his voice calm, telling them to lower their weapons and move to the collection point. They do so without protest, their faces blank with exhaustion and relief. More soldiers follow, the exodus building into a steady stream. They are disarmed by American soldiers who work quickly and without drama, checking for hidden weapons, separating officers from enlisted men, logging names and units. Medics move through the group, checking for injuries, handing out water and cigarettes. The surrender is not cinematic. It is procedural, almost bureaucratic, a process that has been practiced in training and is now being executed in reality. The Wehrmacht soldiers do not speak much. They sit where they are told to sit, accept the water they are given, and wait for whatever comes next. They look tired, and they look relieved, and they do not look like men who have betrayed anything. They look like men who have chosen survival over sacrifice, and who have been given permission to make that choice without shame. The SS commander and a handful of die-hard SS troops remain in the strongpoint, refusing to surrender. They retreat to the deepest cellars, and for the next hour they fight, firing from positions that offer no escape. The Americans do not rush them. They isolate the positions, bring up armor, and methodically clear the last resistance with the same steady pressure they have been applying for weeks. By mid-morning, the strongpoint is silent. The SS commander is dead, killed by a tank shell that collapsed the cellar he had barricaded himself in. His body is recovered later, along with the bodies of the SS troops who stayed with him. The Wehrmacht soldiers who surrendered are counted and processed. 850 men. The number matching the intelligence estimates almost exactly. The American casualties during the final phase are minimal, fewer than a dozen wounded and none killed. The strongpoint is secured. The siege is over, and the city of Aachen continues its slow transformation from a battlefield to a ruin that will someday be rebuilt. In the after-action reports filed by the battalion, the surrender is attributed to tactical pressure, supply exhaustion, and the Wehrmacht's loss of will to fight. The young officer's role is mentioned briefly, almost as a footnote. The report notes that negotiation attempts were made, that the initial attempt was rejected, and that subsequent outreach to Wehrmacht NCOs facilitated the final surrender. It does not mention the mockery, the white flag, or the quiet understanding that men will choose survival if given a path that does not require them to betray themselves in front of their peers. It does not mention the language, the timing, or the psychological terrain that had to be mapped before the surrender could happen. The officer reads the report and does not object to the omissions. His job was never to be remembered. His job was to create the conditions where surrender became possible. And that job is done. The SS commander's mockery is not mentioned again, because the white flag was never about courage or cowardice. It was about creating a choice where none existed before. The Wehrmacht soldiers who walked out of the strongpoint did not do so because they were weak. They did so because they were given permission, because the offer was made visible, because the SS commander's authority was exposed as performative rather than absolute. The officer's competence was invisible, measured not in heroism, but in lives that did not have to be lost. 850 men walked out alive because someone understood that words, used precisely, could accomplish what artillery could not. The contradiction remains, written into the history of the siege but rarely spoken aloud. The SS called it cowardice. The Americans called it negotiation. And the Wehrmacht soldiers called it survival, which is the oldest and most honest reason men have ever had for choosing to stop fighting.